What if the moment that's supposed to celebrate love quietly introduces something that feels completely wrong, something small on the surface but heavy enough to change everything? Because that's exactly how it began for me. Not with a fight, not with suspicion, but with a simple envelope placed too carefully on the table, as if it carried more than just paper inside it. The house was still holding onto the aftertaste of celebration, soft traces of flowers, sugar, and laughter lingering in the air, the kind of atmosphere that usually brings comfort, but that day, something about it felt off, like the warmth was already fading faster than it should. My daughter sat across from me, her face still glowing with that fragile happiness that comes right after a wedding, the kind that hasn't yet been tested by reality, and beside her, her husband leaned back with an ease that didn't quite match the moment, his posture relaxed, confident, almost rehearsed, like someone who already knew how this conversation would go. Have you ever noticed how some people don't enter your life naturally? They position themselves in it, because that's what I began to feel, even before a single word was said. Then, without hesitation, he slid the envelope across the table, stopping it just short of my teacup, the movement smooth, deliberate, almost symbolic, as if he was placing something into my life that I hadn't asked for but was expected to accept. "This will make things easier moving forward," he said, his voice calm, polished, carrying that kind of confidence that sounds reassuring until you listen closely. My daughter smiled immediately, almost too quickly, as if she had already agreed with whatever was inside without needing to read it herself. "It's just a small formality," she added, her tone light, eager, wanting me to understand, or maybe wanting me not to question it too much. And in that moment, I felt something subtle but sharp settle in my chest, not fear, not anger, but instinct, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't panic, just alerts you quietly that something isn't right. Have you ever trusted your instincts before you had proof, and later realized they were trying to protect you? I didn't open the envelope immediately. I didn't reach for it the way they expected. Instead, I let it sit there between us as if its presence alone was enough to understand that this wasn't just paperwork. This was positioning, framing, control disguised as convenience. He continued speaking, explaining something about financial alignment, about planning for the future, about how everything would be simpler if things were structured properly from the beginning, his words smooth, almost too smooth, like something practiced more than once before being delivered. And as he spoke, I noticed something else, not what he said, but how he said it. There was no hesitation, no space for questions, no invitation for discussion, just a direction presented politely but firmly enough that it felt less like a suggestion and more like a decision already made. Have you ever been included in something that didn't actually include your choice? Because that's what this felt like. My daughter nodded along as he spoke, her eyes moving between him and me, not questioning, not doubting, just following, and in that moment I realized something quietly unsettling. Not only was this not her idea, she didn't even see the problem with it. And that realization didn't hurt the way you might expect. It didn't break me. It simply made something clear. That influence had already begun shaping her perspective in ways she didn't fully understand yet. I finally picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands, heavier than paper should feel, heavier than something simple should be, and I looked at my name printed neatly on the front, formal, impersonal, distant, as if I wasn't part of a family conversation, but a subject in a transaction. Have you ever seen your name written somewhere and felt like it didn't belong to you anymore? That's what this felt like. I didn't open it in front of them. I didn't give them the reaction they were expecting because I had already learned something important over the years. When something feels wrong, the worst thing you can do is react too quickly. So I placed it gently beside me and said only what was necessary, something neutral, something that didn't reveal what I was thinking, because not every thought needs to be shared immediately. They seemed satisfied with that, or maybe they assumed silence meant agreement, because people often mistake calmness for compliance. Have you ever stayed quiet just to understand more? Because that's what I was doing. They didn't stay long after that. Plans were mentioned, travel was discussed, details that filled the space without addressing what actually mattered, and before I knew it, they were gone, their car disappearing down the driveway as if nothing significant had just happened. The house fell silent again, but this time it felt different, not peaceful, not warm, but aware, like something had been introduced that couldn't be ignored anymore. I sat there for a moment, the envelope still untouched beside me, and for the first time since they arrived, I allowed myself to feel what I had been holding back, not emotion, not reaction, but recognition. Because deep down, I already knew this wasn't about convenience. This wasn't about planning. This was about something else entirely, something calculated, something intentional. And slowly, I reached for the envelope again, knowing that whatever was inside it wasn't just paperwork. It was a beginning. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just reading their plan, I was about to understand exactly what they were really after. What if the people trying to take control of your life had no idea you were already 10 steps ahead? Because that's the part no one saw, not my daughter, not her husband, not even the man who slid that envelope across the table with so much confidence. None of them knew that the story they thought they were entering was not the real one. And sometimes the most powerful position you can be in is the one where everyone underestimates you. Have you ever noticed how dangerous it is when someone assumes they fully understand you when they don't? Because that assumption becomes their weakness. I sat alone after they left, the house quiet again, the envelope finally open in my hands, the pages inside filled with structured language, precise terms, carefully written clauses designed to look reasonable on the surface but controlling underneath. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a system, a framework that would slowly pull everything I had into something they could manage, monitor, and eventually control. A trust, they called it, a future plan. Something that sounded responsible, forward thinking, almost admirable, until you looked closely enough to see where the control actually lived. And it wasn't with me. Have you ever read something that looked harmless until you understood what it really meant? Because that's what this was. Every paragraph carried intention, every line shaped to guide decisions in one direction, and at the center of it all, him. Not us, not family, him. That's when I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, not out of stress, but out of recognition, because I had seen this before, not in the same form, not with the same faces, but the same pattern. Different words, same intention. Control disguised as care, strategy hidden inside kindness, and suddenly the situation didn't feel confusing anymore. It felt familiar. Have you ever realized that something feels wrong because you've seen it before in a different form? Because that recognition changes how you respond. I placed the papers down and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, letting my thoughts settle into something clearer, something sharper, because now this wasn't about reacting emotionally, it was about understanding strategically. Because if someone is making a move this calculated, you don't respond with emotion, you respond with awareness. And that's when something else came to the surface, something they didn't know, something they couldn't have known, something I had kept hidden not out of secrecy, but out of protection. Have you ever held onto something important, not because you wanted to hide it, but because you understood what would happen if the wrong people found out? Because that's exactly what this was. My late husband had always been careful, not paranoid, not secretive without reason, but thoughtful, deliberate, someone who understood that not everything needed to be visible to everyone. And after he was gone, there were decisions I had to make quietly, carefully, without drawing attention, without creating questions, because sometimes protection doesn't look like action, it looks like silence. What they believed about me was simple, predictable, comfortable. A widow with a stable home, a modest financial cushion, someone who had enough to live well but not enough to attract attention. And I let them believe that. Because it kept things uncomplicated, it kept intentions clean, it kept people honest, at least the ones who deserved to be. But what they didn't know was that the reality was very different, much different. Have you ever realized that the less people know about what you have, the more honest their behavior becomes? Because that's exactly what had happened. What I had, what I had protected, what I had quietly secured over time, wasn't something that needed to be displayed or discussed. It wasn't something I used to influence people or control situations. It simply existed untouched, unseen, and most importantly, safe. And standing there, looking back at that contract, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't about planning for the future. This was about accessing something they believed existed, but didn't fully understand. They were reaching for something without knowing its shape, and that made them dangerous, but it also made them predictable. Have you ever noticed that people who think they're in control often reveal their intentions too early? Because that's exactly what had just happened. He moved too quickly, too confidently, too directly. And in doing so, he showed me exactly what he wanted, without realizing I could see it. I returned to the table, picked up the papers again, and this time I didn't read them as a participant, I read them as an observer. Someone outside the situation, someone analyzing it, breaking it down, understanding not just what was written, but why it was written that way. And once you shift into that perspective, everything becomes clearer. The strategy, the timing, the positioning, it all made sense now. And when things make sense, they become manageable. And when they become manageable, you gain control. I closed the folder slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I had already seen enough. I didn't need to question anything anymore. I didn't need to guess. I knew exactly what this was. And more importantly, I knew exactly how to respond, not with rejection, not with confrontation, but with something far more effective. Something they would never expect. Because sometimes the best way to deal with someone who is trying to outmaneuver you is to let them believe they're succeeding. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to refuse their plan, I was going to use it. What happens when someone stops pretending and starts pushing harder than they should? Because pressure doesn't just test a situation, it exposes it. And that's exactly what happened next, not slowly, not subtly, but in a way that made everything impossible to ignore. The very next morning, before I had even fully settled into the clarity I found the night before, there was a knock at my door, sharp, deliberate, not the kind that waits politely, but the kind that expects to be answered. Have you ever felt urgency from someone who has no right to rush you? Because that's what it felt like. I opened the door calmly, and standing there was a man who didn't belong to my world, not in the way family does, not in the way relationships grow naturally, but in the way transactions arrive, formal, controlled, carrying authority that isn't earned but assumed. He introduced himself with confidence, the kind that comes from repetition, from delivering the same message to different people who rarely question it. A lawyer, representing them, representing a situation I hadn't agreed to. Have you ever been included in something so officially that it feels like your consent was already assumed? Because that's exactly what this was. He held a folder in his hand, similar to the one I had opened the night before, but this one felt different even before I saw it because it carried urgency, and urgency in situations like this rarely benefits the person being pressured. He asked if he could come in, his tone polite but his posture already moving forward as if the answer was expected, and for a moment, instinct told me to refuse, to close the door, to create distance. But another part of me, quieter but stronger, told me something else. Understand first, act later. Have you ever realized that sometimes letting someone speak reveals more than stopping them? Because that's what I chose to do. I stepped aside, letting him enter, watching carefully how comfortably he moved, how naturally he placed his briefcase on my table, how quickly he positioned himself as someone in control of the conversation, and that alone told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't new for him. This was routine, and that meant there was a system behind it. He opened the folder and began explaining, his words smooth, structured, carefully arranged to sound reasonable, to sound protective, to sound like something designed for long-term benefit, but beneath all of that was something else: direction. Not suggestion, not discussion, direction. He spoke about combining financial futures, about aligning resources, about ensuring stability for generations to come, and then, almost casually, he pointed to a section that changed everything. A clause that required full disclosure, not partial, not optional, full, every asset, every holding, present and future. Have you ever seen something written so formally that it hides how invasive it really is? Because that's exactly what this was. They weren't just planning, they were searching, not for structure, not for balance, for access. And in that moment, the situation became crystal clear. This wasn't about building something together. This was about locating something they believed I had and positioning themselves to reach it. I looked at the page again, my daughter's signature already there, written in her familiar handwriting, but rushed, slightly uneven, not the way she signs something she fully understands, but the way she signs something she trusts someone else to explain. And that realization didn't make me angry, it made me certain, because trust, when misplaced, becomes the easiest door for manipulation to enter. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you didn't realize what you were agreeing to? Because that's exactly where she was, and that's what worried me the most. Not the contract, not the pressure, but the fact that she didn't see it. The lawyer continued speaking, explaining timelines, expectations, how quickly this needed to be finalized to avoid complications, and that phrase alone told me everything. When someone creates urgency, it's rarely about efficiency. It's about preventing you from thinking clearly, and that's exactly what I refused to do. I placed my hands gently on the table, not aggressively, not defensively, just enough to stop the momentum of the conversation, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, not reacting to his pressure, but redirecting it. I told him clearly that I do not sign anything without independent review, that I would need time, that I would decide when and how to proceed, and for the first time since he entered, I saw it, a small shift in his expression. Not anger. Not frustration, just interruption, because I had stepped outside the process he expected. Have you ever disrupted someone's plans simply by refusing to rush? Because that's what this was. He recovered quickly, of course. Professionals like him always do, but the shift had already happened. The conversation was no longer controlled by him, it had slowed. And slowing something down is often the first step in taking control of it. He asked when he could expect a response, his tone still polite, but now slightly tighter, more careful, and I gave him the only answer that mattered, that he would hear from me when I was ready. Not when they expected, not when it was convenient, when I decided. And that distinction mattered more than anything else said in that room. He left shortly after, his presence fading just as quickly as it had arrived, but what he left behind wasn't just a document, it was confirmation. Confirmation that what I suspected was real, that this wasn't curiosity, it was intention. And intention, once revealed, can be prepared for. And that's when I stopped thinking about what they wanted and started planning what I would make them believe instead. What if the smartest move isn't to fight back, but to let them think they're winning? Because most people prepare for resistance. They expect arguments, refusals, emotional reactions. But they rarely prepare for cooperation that isn't real, and that's exactly where I decided to go next, not toward confrontation, but toward strategy. Have you ever realized that the best way to understand someone's intentions is to give them just enough space to reveal them? Because that's what I chose to do. I didn't call them back immediately. I didn't respond with questions or concerns. Instead, I gave the situation something it hadn't expected, silence with purpose. Not hesitation, not confusion, but controlled distance. And in that space, I began preparing something far more powerful than any argument I could have made. I reached out to someone I trusted completely, someone who had known my husband for years, someone who understood not just legal language, but human behavior, the kind that hides behind it. When he answered, I didn't need to explain everything from the beginning. I didn't need to build context slowly, because people like him don't just listen to what you say, they understand what you mean. Have you ever spoken to someone who already knows where your thoughts are going before you finish your sentence? Because that's exactly how that conversation felt. I explained what had been presented to me, the contract, the pressure, the urgency, the request for full disclosure, and then I paused, not because I didn't know what to say next, but because I wanted to be very clear about what I was about to ask. I told him I didn't want to refuse the plan, and for a brief second there was silence on the other end, not confusion, not concern, just recognition, because he understood immediately that this wasn't about agreement. This was about positioning. Have you ever realized that sometimes saying yes can be more powerful than saying no when it's used correctly? Because that's exactly what this was. I told him I needed something that looked real. Something structured, believable, legally sound on the surface, but intentionally incomplete in its depth. A version of reality that could be accepted without question, but wouldn't expose anything that actually mattered. Not a lie that would collapse under pressure, but a controlled narrative that would guide their assumptions in the direction I wanted. Have you ever created something not to deceive, but to reveal the truth of someone else's intentions? Because that's what this was becoming. He didn't ask why, he didn't challenge the idea. He simply asked how far I wanted to go, and that question mattered because strategy always depends on scope. I told him I didn't need anything dramatic. I didn't need something large enough to attract attention. I needed something just convincing enough to satisfy curiosity, but not valuable enough to be protected. Something modest. Something believable, something that would answer their question without giving them what they were really looking for. Have you ever realized that what you show people determines how far they're willing to go? Because that's exactly what I was planning to test. Over the next few days, everything was prepared carefully, not rushed, not sloppy, not emotional, but precise. Every detail mattered. Every number had to make sense. Every document had to look consistent, traceable, legitimate. Because if you want someone to believe something completely, you don't just tell them, you build it in a way they can verify. And once they verify it themselves, they trust it even more. Have you ever trusted something more because you thought you discovered it on your own? That's exactly the kind of reaction I was preparing for. When it was ready, I didn't send it directly. I didn't present it formally. Instead, I placed it somewhere it could be found naturally, somewhere it wouldn't feel like it was given, but uncovered, because people don't question what they believe they've discovered themselves. They accept it, they rely on it. And more importantly, they act on it. Then I waited, not anxiously, not impatiently, just observantly. Because once the setup is complete, the most important part isn't action, it's watching. Watching what they do. Watching how they respond. Watching how far they're willing to go based on what they believe is true. Have you ever realized that people reveal their real intentions when they think no one is watching? Because that's exactly what I was about to see. The days passed quietly, nothing unusual on the surface, no sudden changes, no direct reactions, but I knew something was happening beneath that silence, because when curiosity turns into opportunity, people don't stay still, they move. And the only question now was how far would they go? And then, exactly when I expected it, they made a move that confirmed everything I needed to know. What hurts more, the feeling that someone might betray you, or the moment you finally know they did, because uncertainty can be managed, it can be questioned, it can even be ignored for a while, but proof changes everything. And that's exactly what arrived, not loudly, not dramatically, but through something small enough that most people might overlook it, something technical, something quiet, but powerful enough to remove every last doubt. It started with a notification, the kind you don't expect, the kind you don't look for, but once you see it, you understand immediately that something isn't right. Have you ever received a small alert that ended up meaning something much bigger? Because that's what this was. I looked at my phone, reading the message carefully, not reacting, not jumping to conclusions, just absorbing it, because after everything that had already happened, I had learned something important. Reaction clouds clarity, and clarity was exactly what I needed now. There had been an attempt, not a question, not a mistake. An attempt. Someone had tried to access an account that hadn't been active for a long time, an account connected to details only a very limited number of people knew about, details that weren't public, weren't shared, weren't easily guessed. And in that moment, everything slowed, not because I was shocked, but because I was confirming what I had already begun to understand. Have you ever seen something happen that you already expected, and instead of surprise, you felt certainty? Because that's exactly what this was. I didn't call anyone immediately. I didn't confront anyone. Because confrontation without full understanding only creates noise, and I didn't need noise, I needed clarity. I sat there quietly, letting the information settle, reviewing it carefully, understanding the details, the timing, the method, because every action leaves a pattern, and patterns reveal intention. And the more I looked at it, the clearer it became this wasn't random. This wasn't curiosity. This was deliberate, directed, intentional. Have you ever realized that when someone crosses a line, they don't hesitate the way you expect them to? Because that hesitation only exists when there's doubt. And here there was none. I leaned back in my chair, my mind moving through everything that had happened leading up to this moment: the contract, the urgency, the request for disclosure, the subtle pressure, the assumptions, the positioning, and now this. It all connected, every piece, every step, every move. And once everything connects, you no longer question what you're dealing with, you understand it completely, and understanding changes how you respond. But what made this moment different wasn't just the attempt itself, it was what it revealed about trust. Because access like this doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from proximity, from familiarity, from someone being close enough to not raise suspicion. Have you ever realized that betrayal rarely comes from strangers? It comes from those who are allowed close enough to try, because that's exactly what this was. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise, because anger reacts, precision acts, and I needed to act carefully now because this wasn't just about protecting what I had, it was about understanding how far they were willing to go. That night I sat quietly, the document still in front of me, the notification still fresh in my mind. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel something beyond clarity, not emotion, not fear, but confirmation. Because everything I had prepared for, everything I had anticipated, everything I had suspected was now real. And when something becomes real, the way you move changes completely. Have you ever reached a point where you stop asking if and start preparing for what next? Because that's exactly where I was. But there was one more layer to this situation, something deeper than the action itself, my daughter. Because while everything pointed clearly in one direction, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was part of this environment, part of this influence, part of something she might not fully understand yet. And that's where things became complicated, not strategically, but emotionally. Because protecting yourself is one thing, protecting someone who doesn't see the danger is something else entirely. Have you ever known the truth, but realized someone you love isn't ready to accept it? Because that's where I found myself. I knew what had happened, I understood what it meant. But confronting it directly, without preparation, without care, without the right moment, could do more damage than good. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about proving the truth. It was about revealing it in a way that couldn't be denied. Because proof alone doesn't always change minds, but timing does. I picked up my phone slowly, not to accuse, not to react, but to initiate something else entirely. A conversation not about what had happened, but about what would happen next. Something controlled, something deliberate, something that would bring everything into the open at the right moment. Because now that I had proof, I wasn't going to confront them, I was going to let them expose themselves completely. What if the proof you needed was already out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be seen? Because sometimes people don't just make mistakes, they document them without realizing it, and that's exactly what I discovered next, not through confrontation, not through confession, but through something far more reliable than either of those, evidence that didn't depend on memory or emotion. Have you ever realized that the truth doesn't need to be forced? It just needs to be found, because that's what this became. After the attempt I had seen, after the clarity I had gained, I understood something important. This wasn't going to end with one action. People who cross a line like that don't stop suddenly. They continue, they adjust, they try again in different ways. And if I wanted to truly understand the situation, I needed more than one moment of proof. I needed a pattern that couldn't be explained away. So instead of reacting immediately, instead of stepping in too early, I chose to observe further, to gather, to confirm. Because when you move too quickly, you give people time to change their story. But when you wait, you allow them to reveal it themselves. Have you ever noticed how people expose more when they think they're safe? Because that's exactly what I relied on. I reached out again, quietly, carefully, not to escalate anything, but to extend the situation just enough for the truth to fully unfold. Conversations were arranged, meetings planned, moments created where everything appeared normal on the surface, but beneath that surface, something else was happening. Everything was being seen more clearly than ever before. And then, unexpectedly, the most valuable piece appeared not in a document, not in a system, but in something far more ordinary, recorded moments from a day they believed was perfect. Have you ever captured something casually and only later realized what it actually contained? Because that's exactly what happened. I reviewed everything slowly, not rushing, not searching blindly, but looking with intention, because now I knew what I was looking for, not confirmation of suspicion, but confirmation of character. And when you look for character, you don't just focus on actions, you listen to words, tone, timing, context. And that's when I found it, not hidden, not encrypted, just there. A moment that wasn't meant for me, a conversation that wasn't meant to be analyzed, but one that revealed more than any formal statement ever could. The tone was relaxed, confident, unaware of being observed in any meaningful way. And in that comfort, the truth slipped out, not directly, not as a confession, but as something even more reliable, intentions spoken casually. Have you ever heard someone say something they didn't think mattered, but it revealed everything? Because that's what this was. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive, it was matter of fact, a glimpse into what was expected, what was planned, what was assumed would happen over time. And in that moment, everything became undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't even impulsive behavior. It was calculated, and more importantly, it was consistent. That's when I understood something critical. This wasn't about catching someone in a mistake. This was about exposing a pattern, and once a pattern is visible, it cannot be explained away. I didn't react immediately. I didn't confront anyone with what I had found, because this wasn't the kind of truth you reveal impulsively. This was the kind you place carefully, at the right moment, in the right way, so that it doesn't create argument, it creates realization. Have you ever realized that how you present the truth matters just as much as the truth itself? Because timing decides impact, and I was no longer interested in arguments. I was interested in clarity that couldn't be denied. I prepared everything quietly, organizing what I had seen, aligning it with what had already happened, connecting the pieces in a way that made the situation complete, not partial. Because partial truth invites doubt, complete truth removes it. And once everything was ready, I didn't feel urgency. I didn't feel pressure. I felt calm because I knew something they didn't. This situation was no longer under their control. Not because I had taken control forcefully, but because I had allowed it to unfold naturally until the truth stood on its own. Have you ever reached a point where you don't need to prove anything anymore because everything is already visible? Because that's where I was. The next step wasn't confrontation, it wasn't accusation, it was simply presentation. And once that happens, everything changes. And when the moment finally came, I didn't need to say much at all because the truth spoke for itself and there was no way to deny it. What happens when someone who thought they were in control suddenly realizes they never were? Because that kind of moment doesn't arrive with noise or chaos, it arrives with silence, the kind that follows when truth is no longer hidden, when there's nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend, and that's exactly how it unfolded, not dramatically, not emotionally, but clearly. By the time we all sat down together, everything was already decided, not by words, not by arguments, but by what had already been revealed. Have you ever entered a conversation knowing the outcome won't depend on what's said, but on what's already known? Because that's where I was. The room felt calm on the surface, but underneath there was something else, tension not from conflict, but from awareness, the kind that builds when people sense that something important is about to be addressed. He carried himself the same way at first, composed, confident, controlled, as if this was just another situation he could manage, just another conversation he could guide. And for a brief moment, I watched him carefully, not with anger, not with judgment, but with understanding, because I had already seen beyond that surface. Have you ever seen someone acting in control when you already know they aren't? Because that changes everything. I didn't begin with accusations. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even start with explanation. Instead, I allowed the moment to settle, to become quiet enough that every word would carry weight, because when you speak too quickly, people defend, but when you create space, they listen. And then gently, without emphasis, without emotion, I placed what I had gathered in front of him. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just there. For a second, nothing happened. Because sometimes the impact of truth doesn't arrive instantly, it builds as understanding catches up with reality. He looked at it, his expression unchanged at first, still composed, still controlled, still holding onto the version of the situation he believed he could manage, but then something shifted. Subtly, almost imperceptibly. A pause that lasted just a fraction longer than it should have. A breath that didn't come as easily as before, and in that moment I knew he understood. Have you ever seen someone realize something before they admit it? Because that realization doesn't need words, it shows itself. He tried to respond, of course. People always do. Not with full denial, not with full acceptance, but somewhere in between, where explanations try to soften what can't be undone. He spoke about misunderstandings, about context, about how things weren't exactly what they seemed, and I listened, not interrupting, not challenging, because I didn't need to. Because once the truth is complete, explanations lose their power. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to defend something when the full picture is already visible? That's exactly what this became. My daughter sat quietly, her expression shifting not in sudden shock but in gradual understanding, the kind that builds slowly, painfully, as pieces come together in a way they never had before. And that moment mattered more than anything else because this wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about helping her see what she hadn't been able to see before. Have you ever watched someone you love finally understand something, even if it hurts them? Because that's what this was. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, wasn't emotional, wasn't reactive. It was steady, clear, and that clarity told me everything had changed. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She wasn't defending anything, she was deciding, and that decision shifted the entire situation. Because once she saw the truth, everything else followed naturally. There was no need for argument, no need for escalation. Just resolution. He realized it too. You could see it in the way his posture changed, in the way his confidence faded, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that it was clear control had shifted completely. Have you ever seen someone lose control without anyone taking it from them? Because that's exactly what happened. And from that point forward, everything moved quickly, not because it was rushed, but because it was inevitable. Decisions were made. Boundaries were set, paths were separated. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with clarity, the kind that doesn't need reinforcement once it's established. And when it was over, there was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, no emotional release the way people expect in moments like this. There was just quiet, the kind of quiet that follows when something difficult has finally been resolved the right way. Later that evening, when everything had settled, when the tension had faded and the reality of what had happened began to feel real, I sat down with her again, not to revisit what had happened, but to understand what came next, because endings matter, but what follows them matters more. Have you ever realized that the real outcome of a situation isn't what ends, but what begins after it? Because that's what this was now, a beginning, not perfect, not easy, but honest. And honesty, once restored, builds something stronger than anything that came before. When she asked me quietly about everything, the past, the decisions, the things I had kept to myself, I didn't avoid it. I didn't hide anything anymore. Because the time for protection through silence had passed, and sometimes the greatest form of protection is truth. I told her everything, not dramatically, not to prove anything, but simply because she deserved to know. And as she listened, I saw something return that had been missing, not innocence, not naivety, but awareness. And awareness is what prevents this from happening again. Have you ever seen someone grow, not because life was easy, but because they finally understood it? Because that's what I saw in that moment. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something settle completely, not relief, not victory, but peace, because this was never about winning. It was about protecting what mattered. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs, but in the end, they lost everything, and we finally saw the truth that mattered most.